Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 4th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible week after week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely heavily on the support of individuals just like you to help offset the costs of producing the show, of paying my incredible assistant, Noelle Dilworth, and paying the incredible team at Pro Podcast Solutions who edit the show as well. I want to give a shout out to my top patrons this week. They include Leonard Prince, Krister Jansen, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Dudas Infinitus, June Sapara, and Ulrika Hagman. If you're interested in supporting the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. You can also visit my different websites to learn more about other ways to support the show by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or whatever RSS feed reader you use, or by shopping in the Talk Nerdy store. So you can visit talknerdy.com and learn everything there as well. All right, let's dive into today's episode. So this is a really fascinating chat, and I think a really important one as well. This week, we sit down with Dr. Cathy O'Neil to talk about her new book, The Shame Machine: Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation. Now, Cathy is a mathematician. She earned her PhD in mathematics from Harvard. She's also the author of a previous book, a best-selling book actually, Weapons of Math Destruction. That's math, M-A-T-H, which won the Euler Book Prize and was also longlisted for the National Book Award. She's worked in finance and tech and academia. She's written a lot of kind of journalism. She launched the LEAD program for data journalism at Columbia, and she also recently founded her own algorithmic auditing company called Orca, that's ORCAA, and she's a regular contributor to Bloomberg Opinion. So mathematician, writer, and really diving deep into these important social issues through this mathematical lens. So she's here to talk about the shame machine. Without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Cathy O'Neil. Well, Cathy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to talk about your new book, The Shame Machine: Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation. I think this is such an important topic, but even before we dive into the topic, to the content, I want to get to know you. And I think the big kind of pressing question is, how does, a mathematician, somebody who has a PhD in math, but has worked in a lot of like applied fields and also has been doing this sort of like public communication of STEM. How do you get onto this topic?
Yeah, it is actually a pretty nerdy story, so appropriately so. Basically I connected two dots, and then I went from there. So the first dot was when I was interviewing teachers for my previous book, Weapons of Math Destruction. So these teachers were getting fired or being denied tenure, which is tantamount to being fired, based on an algorithm that nobody could explain to them. And we later found out was mostly like a random number generator. It was awful. And so I'd interview these teachers, and I was like, well, did you ask anyone to explain the score? And they were like, oh, yeah, well, I asked, but they told me it was math and I wouldn't understand it.
What?
And I was
teachers?
Like, to the teachers. And I was like, well, what did you do then? And because as a mathematician, I was like, well, that is some bullshit, and that is, in fact, if someone said that to me, I would laugh. I would say, like, dude, if you can't explain it, it's your problem, not mine, But that's not what these teachers did. And I also had a principal friend who, similarly, I asked her to get me the formula because her teachers were getting, denied tenure. And she was like, well, she had to ask 3 times at the different levels of the Department of Education in New York City. And each time she was told, like, you don't want to see this white paper. You don't want to see it. It's math. You want to understand it. And so after, hearing this a bunch of times, I realized this is not just So, and by the way, she persisted because I was asking her. I was like, no, I
Right.
want to see that. Right.
Right.
But the fact that she kept on getting told the same thing that the teachers kept on getting told, it made me realize, number one, that it works in general. It's a systemic mechanism to get people to stop talking. And
Right.
number two, that it's like shame. It's really math shaming people. It's basically saying you're too ignorant to be, included in this conversation. So just take your, pencils and leave the building. And it was very powerful. I would even argue that the power of this terrible algorithm called the value added model for teachers wasn't statistical. It was a bad statistical model. It was the power that made it actually function was shame. And I was like, wow, that's, and it was easy for me to observe that again, because I didn't share that, right? As a mathematician, I don't share that vulnerability. Nobody can call me out for not knowing math. But I just kind of observed that, put it in my pocket. That's the first dot. And then 2 years later, I'm like, it's the summer that the book is coming out, 2016, and I'm in this I'm in this state because my brother, who was a couple of years older than me, had just gotten diagnosed with diabetes. My dad was dying of diabetes. I was ripe for getting diabetes. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Diabetes sucks, from the perspective of somebody who lived with, a sick father their whole lives. Um, and I was doing research on Google, right? Because I read an article that said that bariatric surgery could help you not get diabetes or even help you recover from diabetes. And so I was trying to do research on this bariatric surgery, different types, where I could get it done. And I was just inundated with fat shaming
Yeah.
advertisements. And of
Yeah.
course, bariatric surgeries are technically weight loss surgeries. I mean, that's what they are primarily, in fact, considered, even though I don't know why, because they work better for against diabetes than against weight, believe it or not. They work well for weight, but they work even better for diabetes. Um, Little known fact, because why? Because sort of you can sell it better if it's a weight loss thing. It's so weird. But anyway, the point is, I was inundated with this fat shaming messaging. And at the end of each research session, which I did every day for 3 or 4 days, I just wanted to crawl into a hole and die. I felt like, oh, maybe I deserve to die of diabetes. Like maybe that's because I'm so fat and I'm so fat and that's my fault. And I was just like, wait a second, Cathy, I finally was like, wait, what is happening to me? And I was like, Cathy, you know, you're not fat shameable. Like you had that problem as a youth, of course, but you got a job and had kids and, your life was defined by more than your fatness. And, this is my internal dialogue, but I'm like, yeah, but I feel really just only defined by my fatness right now. And maybe that's why I deserve to die. You know what I mean? It was so bad. And it also it was like this thing where it's like it felt so bad. It made me feel so unlovable and unworthy that I was willing to pay whatever it would take to make that feeling go away. And I realized that that's exactly what was happening to me. Like I was being shamed and told to buy something.
So
The
that's the connection right there. This
exactly.
this pervasive social pressure that we internalize, and it really runs the gamut, which we'll be diving into all the different kind of manifestations, and it's direct link to sort of our capitalist system.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's not just about making money off of me, which was, of course, exactly what was happening at that moment. It's
Mhm.
also about maintaining power and status quo,
Mhm.
which was happening to the teachers. But, long story short, it was a very long story, and I'm sorry it took so long. But the short
No, no,
version
no.
of it is that was the second dot. I was like, oh, I am the teachers now. Like, I get it. I get that feeling where you're going to cede your rights, certainly your money, cede what, basically, I will do anything to make this feeling stop. How do I make this feeling stop? Yes, I will do anything. And I was like, I get it now. I really get it. And as soon as I got it, as soon as I saw shame as the underlying power for both of those events, which are very different events, right? I was like, wait, where else is the power of shame present that I haven't noticed before? And so I started thinking through it more. And that's when I became obsessed with this notion of like, where is shame? When does it happening? And of course, importantly, when is it appropriate? Because as a member of Occupy Wall Street, which I was after the financial crisis, had been working at a hedge fund. Um, we use shame. We attempted to use shame, but it was, in my opinion, appropriate. We were trying to shame people in the government to like bail out Main Street and not just the banks. You know what I mean? So I also wanted to ask that question, like when is it appropriate? And then of course ultimately also wanted to ask the question, when does it work?
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet, because we're just getting started, but I have to assume is going to be an important part of the conversation. And I want to I want to caveat it first, or maybe not caveat it, but sort of explain where I'm coming from as somebody who is. Right now I'm working on my PhD in clinical psychology, and I'm sort of right at the tail end. I just matched to internship. I'm so excited. So I've
Yay.
got just one more year to go before doctor. It's been a long slog, but right now I work in a cancer center, so I do psychotherapy with patients from every kind of stage, from early diagnosis of cancer to active treatment to recurrence to survivorship, and very often end of life as well, which is kind of the area where I like to specialize. But I've also worked in the foster care system. I'm about to start my internship at an outpatient gerontology counseling center. So for older adults. And one of the things that I see that's so pervasive is that layer of shame in mental health treatment, mental illness. And really a big part of what I work on with my patients is normalizing and validating their experience to try to minimize some of the shame that they feel for being depressed, for being sick, for crying or having panic attacks. And there's like a big kind of layer of shame that's, I think, linked to the stigma around mental illness. So I bring that up first because I think that might guide some of my questions today. But I also want to say one of the things that we haven't touched on yet in this first 10 minutes, but I think will be very relevant, especially to the conversation you were having around math and shaming people about their sort of like STEM literacy, is, good God, is this not also a gendered problem? I mean, I can't help but feel like so much of the power dynamic that has persisted throughout human history is not just linked to, of course, physical violence and actual means of control of women through, through violent means, but also through shame, through belittlement, through minimizing a woman's voice, a woman's power, and making her feel bad about having a voice.
Oh yeah. I mean, start with Eve.
Right? It's
The
like
story
from
of
the
Eve.
beginning. Like,
Yeah.
this is also gaslighting, right? Like, this is a form of mental manipulation. It's not just, and it's a way to maintain a power structure.
Yeah, no, exactly. Gaslighting is the right frame. I mean, from my perspective, it is shifting the burden of a society-wide problem onto the victims of that problem. And we see that very consistently. I wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction about the way algorithms did that. But one of the algorithms I studied extensively was an algorithm that sort of predicted somebody's risk of being rearrested and then shifted the blame on the fact that they would be profiled by the police in the future onto them and sent them to prison longer, typically. But it was fascinating to see what sort of the data said, because these scoring systems were built to be accurate, not to be fair, to be who's going to be profiled. And I always, when I talk to audiences about it, I always ask them, what do you think is a predictable feature of somebody that will make them rearrested in the future? And of course, there's poverty. There's a lot of proxies for race, but the two of them that just kind of shock people who haven't thought through this are addiction. Like, if you have an addiction, it's not going to be treated in prison. It's just, you're going to be criminal. You're going to be criminalized for that addiction. And then mental health status. Like, if you have an untreated mental health problem, you will be criminalized, you will be punished, and you will be rearrested in the future and punished more. And it is just what we do. It's how our system works, and it is fundamentally a violation of our dignity.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, not for nothing. I think I personally believe that it's a function of our system not prioritizing mental health or even honestly medical health treatment because we look at treatment from a capitalist perspective, right? We don't see it as a basic human right, so we don't prioritize equal access to treatment. And when we kind of shut down the asylum system for I think arguably good reasons, but we never came up with a sort of backup,
Right.
we end up with these people, all of the people who have profound and pervasive mental illness, the ones that make it hard to stay on medication, that require a lot of intense treatment. There is no safety net for them now, so they're living on the streets. And this is why you see a lot of people with psychotic disorders, a lot of people dealing with being unhoused, just constantly rotating through the prison system because they're getting arrested for things like loitering. Like they're getting arrested for being homeless.
Yes, yes, exactly. And then when the algorithm uses that as a way of predicting that they will be like rearrested, it actually somehow codifies it into the system. And to be clear, the point I'm trying to make with this shame, and I do have an entire chapter about like shaming people like with addictions because it is so prevalent. Um, the point I'm trying to make is that this problem isn't improved by blaming the victims. It is made worse, not just for
Absolutely.
those people, but for all of us, because we all, we're all stuck in this cycle of assuming it can't happen to us. So, that's one of the reasons we do it, by the way. We shame the victims of these problems because it helps us feel safe from those problems.
Right.
And
Somehow distant and even like above those problems.
exactly, because we stigmatize it, we want to think of ourselves as clean and those people as dirty, and it just keeps them at arm's length. But what it does to us is it prevents us, first of all, from having a sort of a cohesive view of humanity, number one, which is already a kind of impoverishment. But it also means that we are completely unprepared when it is close to us, including when it's our kids, when it's ourselves, and we have this automatic self-shaming mechanism that goes into effect at that moment.
Yeah, it's like a negative feedback loop. It becomes exacerbated by the social messages and by the messages from friends and family, and then we internalize it even more, and then it just builds upon itself. And when I was interviewing for internship, I did interview with one location, which I'm actually kind of bummed I didn't end up there, but I'm really thrilled about where I did end up because it was my top choice. But it was a location that was like an HIV/AIDS clinic combined with an opiate recovery clinic. And one of the things that we talked about at length in interview is the importance of the sort of recovery model, a much more modern and sort of progressive model about safe use, about sort of understanding that part of the process of overcoming or of living with addiction is you are going to use, you are going to fall off the sort of, wagon, you are going to have these moments. And it's really about integrating that into your life as opposed to this kind of historical, very abstinence only approach that we did to addiction treatment, which was kind of like no tolerance, can't touch it. If you do, it's like because of a moral failure of your own.
Yeah, and
And
if you
what a
don't mind, I
gross
think
way that we
uh,
used to treat addiction.
if you don't mind, I'm going to step backwards a little bit
Yeah,
and talk about my understanding of when is shame appropriate, because I think
sure.
it fits very nicely into what you just said, which I completely agree with. So I was thinking through like, when does it make sense to shame somebody? Because again, like I think some shaming, punching up shame, I call it, when you're holding power to account.
Yeah, like
Hey,
shaming anti-vax rhetoric coming from people who have an agenda to try to basically decimate public health. Like, yes, we need to make it so that it's embarrassing to believe in that kind of stuff. Because
well,
if it's
we're going to come
embarrassing to
back to
believe in
the
that stuff.
anti-vaxxing in
Okay.
a moment.
Yeah, yeah.
But
That's a
I
whole
was
other thing.
yeah, no, it is. It is a whole other thing because it depends on the context whether I would call that
Mhm.
punching up or not.
And who's the power player? Yeah, but go
And
ahead.
and
Go ahead.
and where whether it would work or not. But anyway, going
Oh,
back to
right,
this
right,
idea
right.
of when is it appropriate, I came up with this lens to see appropriate shame as voice and choice. And choice is easier to imagine. It's like, to what extent is the person you are shaming for misbehaving? By the way, like, you're always shame someone with respect to a rule that you think they've broken. So we can call that a norm. And so there's always a rule in mind when you're shaming someone. And the question about choice is, do they have the choice to follow the rule? Because if you're shaming them for something they actually don't have a choice about, like being fat or being poor or being addicted, it's bullying. It's not actually reasonable. And I will argue, of course, I will concede that, like, there is some amount of control you have over being fat, but not as nearly as much as people think.
And
Like,
not
maybe,
everybody either. Like,
and not everybody.
yeah.
It's kind of like smoking. Like, some people didn't have that much trouble quitting smoking. Other people really do have trouble quitting smoking. So a really better, but more nuanced way of saying is, you actually don't know how much control people have, but
And
less than.
also, by the way, sorry to interject, but when it comes to food, it's a whole other layer of complication, because with things like smoking, we can take an abstinence approach. Like when I quit smoking, I had to draw a line in the sand and say, I can't even just have one. If I just have one, I'm tempting fate, and it's going to be really, really difficult. But you can't do that with food. You have to develop a healthy relationship with food. And for some people, that has nothing to do with their weight either. So, they eat the exact same number of calories, they have the exact same food habits, and they weigh more.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's so much, yeah, it's a complicated
Suffice it
issue.
to say, it's complicated. It's different for each of these examples. But I guess the principle I wanted to bring to bear is that when you're exaggerating somebody's ability to choose to behave, shaming them on that is inappropriate. And so that's the first. And the second one is, does somebody have a voice? Do they have the right to defend themselves, to explain themselves, to be seen improving their behavior, and to be tracked improving their behavior? So what I really mean by that is there a chance for them to be redeemed? And we can go into examples of that as well, which is the short version is, never happens online. Um,
Right. Right.
but going back to your example, like with abstinence only rehabs, say,
Yeah.
um, it is really, it's an unreasonable expectation, which is predicated on the idea that this is a choice that someone's making, and that they're being weak if they slide
Right.
back
That it's all
into.
just a willpower issue.
Yes. Whereas we know it's we know how difficult it actually is. We know how much our brains have changed by the time we're addicted to various kinds of drugs. And we also know that the percentage of people capable of really never using again is really small, but it's bigger if you use medically assisted treatment, and methadone type things. But these are shame based regimens where they'll be like, oh, you can't just replace one addiction for another. Shame on you. You have to be moral, and they make it into a moral choice, and that is inherently shaming. Inherently shaming. So, and the final thing I would say is that, one of the ways one of the things I really wanted my readers to take away from this is that this is not just an individual thing, like that they feel like this is inappropriate. It's inappropriate for me to shame that person because it's not really their choice or voice. I mean, I do want people to think through that, like next time they're tempted to shame. But it's really, what I want to talk about is like the institutionalization of shame. So the institutionalization of shame in the rehab system, in the prison system, even on social media, where I think the institutionalization of shame is in the design itself. It gets us to shame each other and like lob shame and outrage cycles at each other. Because why? Because the longer we spend on Facebook, the more we click on ads. So it like behooves them to design their space for us to be shame driven, and it is.
Right, because they know that shame is such a pervasive and like it cuts to the core in a way that a lot of emotions don't necessarily, and it's able to, like you said, keep us engaged. I mean, what is an Instagram filter other than a way to release or mitigate the shame that a young woman feels when she's online for only a second? That's one of those things that I think,
Oh, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I would even argue the opposite. I'd say those things are meant to increase your shame because it increases your your self-consciousness,
Oh
and it
yeah,
also
that's true.
increases your notion, and this is going back to my definition of like inappropriateness. It increases this notion of choice. Like if you just, you have the choice to look beautiful. Like if you're which the flip side of, if you don't look beautiful, you have failed and you should be ashamed.
And I think those are two sides of the same coin, to be honest. I think that's the entire sort of beauty industry as well. It's this, and even when you look at things facial cleansers, like I could go in my shower right now and look at the sort of marketing on all of the products, and they're gonna say things like unclogs pores. Okay, so a clogged pore, what does that even mean? Like, so you are dirty. You are dirty with dirt and you need to purify yourself.
Exactly. I would my favorite example in my book along these lines is the Vagisil product for teenage girls called OMV exclamation point. And the idea is like you're supposed to say like not OMG, oh my God, but oh my vagina exclamation point. And what it does is it fosters the notion that your vagina is too smelly and you need to keep it unsmelly with a deodorant, which then by the way gives you yeast infections, so then you'll need Vagisil. You know what I mean? And
Right,
it's
right.
like
That's like
this.
a douche, like the concept of douche,
Yes.
like
So
cleaning yourself. When anybody who's ever spoken to a gynecologist is like, "Do not douche. Douching is
yeah,
not a
don't
thing.
do
You
it.
don't need
Just
it. You're not supposed to do it."
exactly. But the idea being, we're going to instill shame in you and then sell you a product to try to make you feel better. And I feel like that's
Exactly.
what those filters do.
Yeah, that's that temporary relief of the shame that's being actively induced, and it really is temporary. It's just a little dopamine hit in order to kind of keep you going, and it really concerns me when I think about the global effect, because I think there's two different ways to look at this, right? There's this sort of less pernicious. Shame is ever present, is ever ubiquitous. And then there are the industries or the institutions that are sort of capitalizing on that. They know it's there. So if they can tap into it and utilize it to their advantage, okay. And then there's the even more pernicious. We're actually going to develop and create and implement and exacerbate the shame. We're going to actually physically induce it so that then we can try to give you that hit to relieve it and you'll pay us for it. And that to me is like extra gross.
It's, and I'll just add another little gross element now that we're speaking on those terms. Like, one of the things that really grosses me out about the modern weight loss industry is that they're always claiming that diets don't work, and we all know that. And that's why what they're doing is not actually a diet, and then it's a diet. So it's like this, it's like so patronizing. It's like concern trolling. Like, we just want you to be healthy, bullshit. And then they accompany that with the same old kind of crappy statistics that quote unquote prove that their diet program works, which they refuse to call a diet. So similarly with like OMV exclamation point by Vagisil, they start out by saying, a period should never be stigmatized. We believe in the beauty of all women. By the way, you smell bad and you should buy
Yeah.
our product. So it's like this completely fake like
Mhm.
flip of like, oh,
Mhm.
we are anti-shame. Here's the shame. This is our product. It is based entirely on shame.
Yeah, 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 and I think that that's, that you see that too in, like we said, in like the facial cleansers and the makeup and all of the different ways that these different sort of organizations, these different corporations buy into this machine, which is let's make especially young women, but also older women as well. But really everybody on the planet, like we'll figure out a way to tap into your specific insecurities and let's figure out exactly what it is that you are most likely to feel ashamed about. And then let's offer you a panacea, a palliation for that.
And
Let's
then
offer
and
you.
then when
Uh,
when it fails, when this product that you've bought to alleviate shame doesn't alleviate the shame or actually exacerbates it, that's your fault.
right,
It's,
right, right.
it's
So they're completely off the hook. It's like a win-win
completely off hook.
situation for them.
I don't think Weight Watchers would exist without return customers.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and to the point of women versus men, I agree with you that women are very often the target of the so I would call the classic traditional shame industrial complex, which is, skin creams, anti-aging skin creams, and the diet industry and the cosmetics and all of the body tuning app for making yourself look thinner online. That's definitely gendered. One of the things, though, that I added, that I also addressed in my book, which I don't think is as gendered, is the Prevagen, which is also total claptrap pseudoscience. This idea, Prevagen, you'll see the commercials if you haven't already. It's like for older people who want to stay alert, and it's supposed to help you with your memory. And there's like zero evidence that it does that, but it's selling it. And a lot of the people in the commercial are men who are just like, I wasn't feeling as sharp, but now I take Prevagen and it works for me. And again, it's like, it's sort of like pretending that it's not about shame, pretending it's about like self improvement and kind of a wellness kind of notion. But it's actually like, first shame the person for being old and senile, and then, which is using like the most ridiculous ageist tropes, and then make them pay to stop feeling that way.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We see even a very specific, I guess, other gendered approach with like boner pills and like
Yep.
testosterone treatments and like all of
ED.
these different ways. Yeah, ED, all these different ways to like tap into men's shame around like virility and youth and vigor and vim and all of these things.
Oh
It's
yeah.
just a different sort of social pressure.
And to be clear, like, I didn't have a big enough book. I mean, I couldn't fit all
Yeah.
that stuff in.
Yeah.
What I really intend with this book is to build a lens. If I could, if I could get the people who read this book to be like, oh, I recognize what's happening. I see this. I see this, which I didn't see before, but it used to be invisible to me. Now it's as clear as day. You are shaming that person for the sake of profit, or you're shaming that person to silence them so you keep your power. And if I can get to that point, I will have succeeded. And people don't even have to even necessarily agree with my principles. I mean, I think they're pretty sound, but there might be gray areas. But I want this conversation to be much more explicit about shame, and I want to like improve our terms so that we can really figure out, what is it appropriate to shame anti-vaxxers, to your early example. I mean, and because I actually don't think it always is.
I think it's appropriate to shame like the Andrew Wakefields of the world. I don't think it's appropriate to shame the victims of Andrew Wakefield.
Okay, let me rephrase.
Yeah.
It's probably appropriate to shame anti-vaxxers because it is there's probably a choice there, right? You could take a vax, Um, but the question I want to ask is, will it work?
Does it
Will
have
it
an
work?
outcome?
And I think the answer is typically no. And I think the answer is typically no for, will it work on social media to improve somebody's behavior by shaming them? And the reason is, I think, for shame to work, there has to be a sort of long-standing relationship, and that's why it works sometimes with
Mm.
shaming up. When you're shaming power, like, that person's probably still going to be in power in 3 years, and if they haven't changed their behavior, you'll notice, and they'll know that you know.
I think that's why I always make that distinction. On the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, we often talk about, pseudoscience, anti-science rhetoric, things like, anti-vax sentiment. And we do make a really strong distinction between, like I said, the Andrew Wakefields, the Jenny McCarthys, the power brokers, the people who have a voice and who actually are doing this for like agenda reasons. Like they
Yes,
stand to gain from continuing this rhetoric. I think those are the people we should be shaming. But the
I
people who
totally
sadly
agree.
get caught in their web,
Yeah.
the everyday people who read something online and then they start questioning whether or not they're going to be safe, those are victims. We shouldn't be shaming the victims of the
Yeah,
rhetoric.
I agree, and I'm glad you said it that way. I mean, I am all for shaming Alex Jones, and
Right. Yes. Because he
beyond
is a
shaming
piece
Alex.
of
He's like,
shit.
yeah, it's a piece of shit. But the people that watch his show and are buying into that stuff, I feel like, look, they're probably not going to be swayed by shame. If you want to approach them and talk about a specific thing like vaccination, you first have to find out where are they on the vaccination, like, belief or even receptivity. In other words, you have to check, do they agree with this norm before you shame them with respect to it? And if they are not in disagreement with it, then you have a chance. But then, in order to appeal to them, if they have so far not gotten a vaccine, and this is just a scenario I'm building up, but the point is that it's generalizable. If the norm is possibly shared, then you appeal to them at the level of, hey, we're in the same community and we both care about this community, and I know you don't personally feel like doing this, but it is good for the community, and you have to be able to make that case. And in order to make that case, you actually have to be in a shared community. You can't just be a drive-by jerk saying, hey, you suck,
No, because then you're
because
just going
people
to see a backfire effect. They're just going to dig in
exactly.
further.
And that's exactly the point. Exactly the point. Like, there is, for every sort of strongly held and conflicting norm in this country, like vaccinations, there is a community out there that will house you and make you feel victimized if someone tries this. And it's like, that's not where we want to send people. If you think about it, you're like, I only have a certain amount of, you know, moments in my life. Do I want to be spending them sending people to take solace in those communities where it's like, yeah, you really owned the libs or whatever it is. It's you have better uses for your time. But I will say, by the way, going back to your point of like dopamine hits, I interviewed a psychologist named Molly Crockett who does lab studies on these these outrage cycles, and she found that people get dopamine hits, like pleasure center hits, when they are outraged and punch out at the targets of outrage. So these, I would call them shaming outrage cycles, which typically serve to only push people into their corners and into these like dark communities where they fellow defiant people are hanging out with them. That actually makes us happy. And it's really, that's like
At
the
least
thing that's,
momentarily. Yeah.
well, it's not just momentarily. We get likes and retweets from our friends that makes us feel righteous. And I'm not saying we're not right sometimes. Sometimes we're right. But the question isn't whether we're right. The question is, are we doing something useful? Are we actually helping someone help their community, or are we just performing a virtue that makes us like momentarily feel good and our community support us? So that's one of the questions I ask. And so I agree with you, though. At the end of the day, you absolutely can punch up at somebody who's profiting off of misinformation and is like gaining status and keeping status. But the people who are victimized by those people are probably not the targets you're looking for.
Right. And it sounds like it becomes this very nuanced and very context dependent, but even beyond context dependent, um, there's an ambivalence here to this basic question of let me think of a good example, like flat earthers. So, when we talk about flat earth rhetoric, there is an argument to be made that as an institution or as a cultural phenomenon, we have to maintain a certain level of shame around really, really, really bizarre conspiratorial beliefs, because if it's not sort of embarrassing to believe that, it may take on more of a mainstream um I don't know, hold. And that's really scary for an informed populace, right? Like, we want the populace to be, at least to some extent, making decisions based upon evidence. And so there's a certain level of like extreme kooky beliefs that there is a certain amount of shame that it seems like the institution, the people that are engaged are like, okay, that's beyond the pale. That's sort of like a threshold. And they feel justified in that. But on the flip side, as you said, many people who believe in flat earth kind of science, pseudoscience, they have that sort of, we're in the know, everybody else has the wool over their eyes, they're sheeple, they've been duped, but we're the ones who actually know, and it's very empowering for them. And so it's like, how do you find that sort of that balance? Like, we don't want to create more incels, but we also don't want to go, yeah, being an incel is totally socially appropriate, and we don't want to make you feel shame about that at all. So it's almost like this double-edged sword of like, let's make sure that we maintain a very strong stance that like being a violent anti-woman incel on the internet is not acceptable, while at the same time knowing that the more we say it's not acceptable, the more people are going to become radicalized by
Right. Well, yeah,
it.
no, it's a fair question. I will make the case that people misunderstand what these dark societies, I'll call them, the incels, the flat earthers, the QAnon. I think they misunderstand what people get out of that. Um, I read this book, Beyond Hate, I think it was called, about hate groups, and it was a man wrote it who works with usually almost always boys and men who have emerged from far right radical hate groups that are often like uh, gangs essentially, um, white power groups, etc. And he says like consistently the people who emerged from these groups really didn't buy into the ideology at all. They just wanted friends. They wanted camaraderie. They wanted to feel like they belonged. They had been abused as kids. They had just not they had not managed to have the social connections that made them happy, and they found that kind of community in those groups, and the ideology was something they were willing to swallow in order to feel belonging. And
Right. And it was
I just
empowering for them, right? To
of
have
course
those
it was
friends and
empowering,
to have that role, this
right?
new social role.
And I think if you really look at it that way, even with incels, and I obviously disagree with incels. I wrote
Right.
a whole chapter about incels, and their ideology is really messed up. It stems from loneliness. It stems from this ridiculous notion of what it makes a man in this country. Um, but I will say that our choices are grim. Our choices are shame them and push them further away from you into those groups, or don't shame them and give them an opportunity to emerge eventually and become have normal friendships. Those are your options. Your options are not to talk somebody out of that stuff because uh, unless they ask for that conversation, which of course. But if you start with like shame on you, you're not getting anywhere, because the whole, I mean, especially with the incels, the entire raison d'etre inside the incels is to like to protect away from people being pulled away from incels. So they have this whole like inner ideology about like, here's what you say to someone who tells you that we're wrong, and it's like very well defended. You should think of it as a highly defended, terrible place to be. And you could only hope that the people are like, they eventually lose interest because they meet somebody who's not at all like that, and they're just like, oh, I like that person, I don't need this anymore. Because it is a kind of desperate option, but sometimes it's people's only option, and by shaming them, you make them feel even more that way.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of parallels there with all of the kind of psychological manipulation that we see in cults, right? Like that there are these people who have found a group that accepts them. They have also that also empowers them to have a voice. And sometimes the more violent, the more pernicious, the more disgusting, the better. And so now I can kind of dive deep into these aspects of my personality that were not acceptable previously. I can kind of go to places, very dark places, and explore, some of these very dark aspects of my base desires, and I can do it in a place where I'm fully accepted for who I am, and I don't feel a lot of shame. And that can be a very empowering thing. But then when you're on the flip side of it, right, like as a woman in modern society who's like, incels are, and read about incels. We don't have time to like really do the full background if you don't know what they are, but
Right.
involuntarily celibates, like boys and men who are like pissed off that they can't get laid and really take it out on sort of like, it's like misogyny times a million. But at the same time, how do we maintain a sort of social um moral structure and code that says, okay, as much as I can sort of empathize, and this is a very this is like the psychologist's dilemma, right? Because we are tasked with maintaining these Rogerian tactics when we sit down in a room in a therapy space with a patient. So I
Yeah.
have to maintain a non-judgmental stance. I have to maintain sort of like radical empathy. And that's not easy to do when you're sitting across from, let's say, a convicted child molester. It's
Oh,
not easy to
100%.
do when your
I would.
patient is racist,
Yeah.
but
And
you have to.
to be clear, uh, two things. First of all, I don't envy your job, your future job. Um, Number two, this is not a self-help book. Like, I am not
Right.
suggesting I have a solution to shame. I don't have a solution to shame. What I have is a lens to identify unreasonable or unuseful shaming attempts. I have a very strong uh, urge to especially consider that at an institutional level, at a systemic level, at a level where people are gaining or maintaining power or gaining profit. And so, going to the incels as one example, it would be really hard for me to be in the same room with an incel. I would never suggest my daughter date an incel. There's nothing like that,
Right,
right?
right,
I'm
right.
suggesting that and I would also say that, we should go after the people that are making money by hosting chat forums. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
let's look
yeah.
at it as a structural issue. um, and of course there are people who dabble in incels and are never going to do anything in real life that is evil or really horrifying. And I also want to leave space for the fact that there are just moments of all of our lives where we do stuff that isn't great, you know, but yet we need to have this space, and the opportunity to redeem ourselves by simply leaving and going to a different place, and that is our choice. Our choice is to no longer be part of that. And that is what I'd love to see. I would love to see the doors more opened for folks like that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I agree. It's such a, it's such a complex issue because of course there is, at the one hand, I think, a radical view of full and total acceptance and empathy of all of humanity's peaks and valleys and light and dark corners. And at the other side of that spectrum, there's exactly this concept that you grapple with in the book about sort of punching up versus punching out or punching down. And I think that's an important distinction. This idea, and I know we've touched on it, but we didn't really dive into it too deeply. But maybe you can help those who have never heard of those concepts of like punching up versus punching down sort of understand exactly what you mean.
Yeah. I mean, by punching down, I mean inappropriately shaming somebody. So shaming somebody who doesn't have the choice or doesn't have the voice. And again, choice doesn't have to be complete choice. Sometimes you have a small amount of willpower ability there, but like if you are exaggerating their choice and making it seem easy or something, or if they don't have voice, that means they can't defend themselves or cannot be seen to improve. That means it's no voice. If you do that, if you're shaming somebody with no choice and no voice or one of those missing, then that's punching down. And punching up is when they both have the choice and the voice. And typically it's called up because typically they also have power. Typically that's why you track them, right? So I like to give the example of Sarah Huckabee Sanders being refused service at the Red Hen in Virginia, in Lexington, Virginia. I actually had the chance to go there for dinner because I gave a talk in a nearby place. And I talked to the people that did that, and they were, Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the time was the spokesperson for President Trump. And they were like, she's got to stop lying. We're shaming her for, for misrepresenting truth. Right. And I'm like, well, that is her choice. She chose to do that. So right on, you got that one right. And by the way, does she have a voice? Does the spokesperson for the White House have a voice? Yes, they
Right.
do. You know what I
Yes,
mean?
by definition, they do.
By
Yeah.
definition. And so I was like, right on, that's appropriate. And also I would agree with you, like that she should be not lying, and she is lying. So it's I would say that is sort of classic punching up. And the reason I mentioned that example is because some of the people who were offended by it and were defending it, like, oh, where did civility go? As if like we ever had civility. Um, but they actually tried to compare it to, believe it or not, like black people being refused food at a restaurant.
First of all, I totally believe that this group would do that because that's such a classic playbook of like Southern
Right.
strategy is
So
to like
what
flip it on its ear.
exactly. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
what I like about my framing, though, my framework of like for choice and voice, is that it completely exposes that, right? So black people being refused food service Did they have a choice? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
No. Did they
not
have a
at all.
voice? No, the
No.
point is they had no voice. The point is they were being silenced and they were being suppressed. So it is just not the same thing. It's just not the same thing because of that, because of these aspects that I'm talking about. So that's punching down. Punching down is punching down on powerless people for things that they don't have a choice about, namely the color of their skin. Punching up is punching up at somebody who should know better, and we will be watching them.
I love the choice and voice. It's such a simple kind of approach, such a simple thing to remember, especially for people who do struggle with the parallel structure. I think the sort of arguments that you often see, especially um, on the extreme and kind of entrenched right, like the reverse racism arguments, like all of these sort of like anti-social justice arguments that almost have a sheen of fairness and egalitarian motivation, but they don't, right? We know that they don't because they break when we really start to investigate. But on the surface, for some people, an argument about reverse racism seems equitable. It seems fair. But once you really start to have that conversation about voice and choice, it falls apart very quickly.
Yeah, that's the idea. The idea is I don't want to just talk about three or quite a few, maybe 30, 40 examples of shame and whether it's appropriate. I want people to leave with the book thinking like, now I have the tools to decide whether when I witness shame, whether it's appropriate, and in particular whether I should target people with shame.
Right. And also, I think, how do I protect myself from those who are targeting me with shame?
Yes, or at least how do I understand them? And to
Right.
be just to reiterate that feel uh I don't feel like I have gotten through the shame. Like I'm still vulnerable to fat shaming. But at least I will be able to recognize it. I'll be like, "Oh, I see what you're doing there. You're trying to shame me for being fat. By the way, I don't have much of a choice about it." Blah blah blah. I can make the entire argument. I can make them feel bad about them what they did, and think twice before doing it again. But I'm not claiming that this will actually not like cure shame.
Well, I think the thing that's so important about this is that, and this is something that I often find myself navigating with patients in the therapy space. Is number one, it's kind of pithy, but we often say first comes insight, then comes action. You can't do anything about something if you don't even recognize it's happening. And the thing about shame is that it happens kind of below the radar. It's such a strong social influence that we just feel gross and we don't even know why. And we blame ourselves for it and we don't even know why. So you're right. The more important than even doing anything about it or knowing what to do, which, that is an open-ended question, is recognizing when it's happening so that you can at least say, I don't really think I'm responsible right now. I think this might be being done to me, and I think that that's super important. And then the second side of that, which I mentioned at the very beginning, is that, a big part of what I do in therapy is validate and normalize. And when somebody says, I don't know, I didn't expect when I got my mastectomy that it would hit me this hard. And like, it makes me feel like I'm a narcissist or I'm vapid, but like, it's really, really emotionally detrimental that I look different now. And it's like, well, how could it not be? Think about the world you live in. Think about every message you've received from the time you were born about your femininity and your motherhood and your value and so just really, really being able to make the implicit explicit can be really empowering for people, I think.
I agree. And I'm a Buddhist, so I believe that like being mindful and observing things and observing your reaction to things is the first step towards like softening that reaction over time. I just don't want to promise anybody that they're going to find the way to get past shame, because I don't think that's you should believe someone who says that. But I
Right,
do.
right. Because yeah, then we're getting into like, yeah, like Tony Robbins like
Right.
territory.
In fact, I would even argue that like self-help books per se are shaming because
Of
they
course
do.
they are.
Yes, because they
They're the
do
Instagram
actually.
filter. Let me point out all the things that are wrong with you, and now I have a way out of them.
Or even worse, let me tell you the 6 easy things to do in order to cure yourself of this problem. Wait, you did those 6 easy things and you didn't cure yourself? That's your bad, you know? Like, you should feel ashamed that you weren't successful, you know? So it's yet another thing to feel, ashamed of, in general. But yeah, I mean, listen, go ahead.
Can I ask if you grapple with, and this is sort of, I, I'd go there as an atheist. You mentioned that you're Buddhist. This may or may not be comfortable or appropriate for some people, but like the sort of religious industrial complex and how much shame is perpetuated within a lot of sort of organized religious structures.
Well, I feel, I could have, I feel like there could be another book
Mm-hmm.
written, not by me, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trained. I don't know enough about different religions to do that, to do justice with it. I do, of course, talk about the Catholic Church shaming victims of the, abuse by priests, which is just a classic example of like blaming and shaming the victim so that
Oh
you
yeah,
can
that's like a
maintain
really
power.
gross example.
It is a really gross example, and it's so extreme that I felt like it needed to be addressed.
But
But I
the
would
reason
say
I bring it up is because you mentioned this idea of like you did the 12 easy steps and you still, are struggling with your weight. Shame on you. And it makes me think about this idea that like, well, you just didn't pray hard enough, or like
yes,
you just didn't believe strong enough, and that's why
yeah,
you didn't get
no, I
that
mean,
job.
there was this really excellent book I read in preparation for writing my book, so research, called Pure, and it was written by a woman who had experienced an evangelical childhood where it was an extreme version of like sex shaming of women, where she described this situation where, as a young girl, like maybe 15 or something, she was like shown an Oreo, and like they stomped the Oreo on the floor on under their feet and were like, the Oreo is you, and this is what happens if you have sex before marriage. You know what I mean? And it was like
Yeah,
so
wow.
crazy, and it was like the way she described like the shame that was like burdened to young women, of all of the misbehavior of men of all ages. Like they were all somehow shifted. All the responsibility was shifted onto girls, and they were shamed for it. Like it was so extreme. And I know that's not totally normal, but I also know that's not totally unusual either. So I'm just making the point that there are deep, deep chasms of sort of endemic, sort of built-in embedded shame in certain types of religious institutions that I just, and it's definitely of that second type of like maintaining status quo, maintaining power versus the profiting engines, but it's still deeply troubling.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And sadly, once again, when we think about maintaining status quo and maintaining power historically and to a very large extent still today. Sadly, those power brokers are of a very particular persuasion. They are, generally white, male, cis, heterosexual, religious. Like they're like we could list a lot of things, and anybody who is not within that power structure is very often the target of shame that helps maintain that power structure.
I totally agree, and I would say that like it's a product of, in some sense, it's just a product of power, and
Right. It's almost unintentional. It's baked in.
it's baked in. You'll see shaming opportunities jump up when somebody assumes power. So it's not just going to be the straight white guys, but it is for now mostly them.
And for most of human history, sadly. So listen, there's so much more we could talk about because, like you said, there are a million examples, and really diving deep into it, sort of the structure and the institutional power dynamic that perpetuates shame. But of course, everyone, if you read the book, you're gonna get this. We don't want to give everything away. But Cathy, before you go, two things. First, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you feel like, oh my god, if we don't talk about that, what am I doing here? And second, after that, I have two closing questions that I ask everybody on the show. They're kind of big picture questions, so I'm curious if you're game for that.
Well, I guess the final thing I would impart is that I do think that, and I just did this, and somebody might disagree with me, but I do think there are sort of natural phases of shame. I call them the 4 stages of shame, which are like the first stage is when you're just like literally feel ashamed. It's very, very painful. It feels like someone's punched you in the stomach. Then you have this moment of cognitive dissonance, or maybe many moments, where you're like, wait, but I'm a good person. I can't be unlovable or unworthy. And so you go into this second stage, which is like denial, essentially. You just are in denial about the shame issue. For me, that looked like never looking in a mirror because I just didn't want to think about my body, right? But it could also look like, let's never teach critical race theory, and then we'll never have to talk about our history of racism in this country. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Let's pass a law that says anything that's taught that makes children feel uncomfortable.
Right. By the way, that's code for shame.
Exactly. And it's code for shaming white kids so that they don't have to feel like they're part of the system that harmed Black kids historically.
And I will
And
just add that, like,
yikes.
if we're allowed to be proud of our history, we should also assume the shame of our history.
Absolutely.
But
That's how we don't make the same decisions again. That's how we
yes,
learn from the past. Anyway.
but
Go ahead.
just to finish that thought, which is that,
Yeah.
what does that look like? It means going into the third stage of shame, which isn't going back to the first stage of just feeling shamed all the time. It's not sitting in shame, which some people have said. No, it's reckoning. So I call it the reckoning. And the third stage of shame is when you reckon on a personal level, like, this is where I am. This is how I got here. I tried dieting. It didn't work. I tried it again. It didn't work. Like, I gained weight, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not going to feel like I should go on another diet. It's like a personal reckoning. And then the final stage, or at the level of the country and white shame, it's like, yes, we did have slaves. Yes, we did institute Jim Crow, and yes, we still have racism. It's institutionalized, and we need to do something about it. And so that's the fourth stage, which is taking on the system that put you there in the first place. So for me, that would be like writing this book and like talking about the weight loss industry itself as a system that shames us in order to make us buy their products. Anyway, the point is that it's there. The escape route for shame, I wouldn't say it's ever really escaped, because even when you're in stage 4, you can be triggered back to stage 1, temporarily. But it involves this notion of a reckoning, which I think is the closest that we'll come to actually solving it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I love that. I think that that kind of way to operationalize and view this in a structured way is really, really helpful for a lot of people for whom the idea of shame is sort of an ineffable concept, but now starting to recognize it and understand the power that it has on their lives and really take that power back. I think it can really, really be beneficial. So I appreciate that. So Cathy, listen,
Yeah.
um,
Two questions.
every show ends with these two big picture questions, and they are, as I mentioned, very big picture. So if you need a moment, we understand.
Okay. Oh,
Um,
thank.
the first one, and I want you to think of these in whatever context is relevant to you, like right now in this moment. So it could be very personal. It could be contextualized within the work that you've been doing around shame and humiliation and these institutions, or around mathematics, or it could be more like communal. It could be global. It could be cosmic. Whatever is relevant to you. Number one. What is the thing that is really keeping you up the most at night? What is the thing you're most concerned about? Maybe it's kind of triggering some uh pessimism or even some cynicism in you. Where are you really struggling? And then on the flip side of that, when you think about sorry, I didn't put the caveat of like, when you think about the future, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? On the flip side of that, so we end on a more positive note, where are you finding your hope for the future? What are you genuinely optimistic about?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess the urgent need I felt to write this book is the answer to the first question, which is like, I really think that our online existences, which are basically our existences ever since COVID hit, right? Like, we're just like, even we're working from home, so we're working online. The interactions we have are toxic, and there's such a profit to be made from that, and such a profit to be made from propaganda. If you look at the Ukraine situation, there's so much toxicity in the online world, and it's so profitable, and it is changing the way we think about each other and ourselves, and it is making us addicted to being outraged and to denying each other dignity, and I just don't know how that's going to stop. So I do feel like the new version, the digital version of the shame industrial complex keeps me up at night. And the thing that gives me a little bit of hope, to be honest, and this is kind of ironic, it's along the lines of like herd immunity with, but for shame, is that like young people seem to be a lot less nasty than people my age. I'm 50. I'm almost 50. I just want to say that like I left Facebook after the 2016 election when like people my age were spreading ridiculous false information about how it's not too late for Hillary Clinton to be installed as president. And I was like, yeah, it is. Like, stop.
Yeah.
I was like, we are so credulous. We're so vulnerable to misinformation. We just want to hear what we want to hear. And we are just ready to sink our teeth into whatever is told to us. Whereas I would say that people my kids' age are just like, don't go on the internet. Those people are crazy. So
Yeah.
I'm just like, well, maybe we have a chance then. Maybe our kids will teach us how to, behave.
Yeah. I mean, I often hear in whatever context is super relevant to the person I'm interviewing, whether they're talking about climate change, whether they're talking about, kind of the uh, conversation around what is real, what is fake news, what is evidence based, all the different answers that I often get to this last question. It's not uncommon for the hope to be in a sort of new generation. And I do think there is, the sort of that moral arc of the universe is bending towards justice. And although sometimes it's, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And of course, there are 20-year-old white supremacists, of course,
Yeah,
there are
yeah.
incels that are 17. They're still, and they're, sometimes that's like that's a function of youth and sort of frontal lobe development. But it isn't an uncommon sentiment that there is a change that happens with young people recognizing injustice and taking a stand and being very vocal and really being willing to go out and march in the streets to
Yeah.
to affect change because they want a world that's better than the world that the fucking boomers left us.
And you know what? I'll just add one more thing that makes me hopeful. I
Mm-hmm.
do feel like the amount of attention we give to our online disputes over nothing that are
Mm-hmm.
like literally manufactured whole cloth by the by the ether
And
and
Russian
Twitter
bots. Yeah.
and bots, yeah.
Yeah.
Like if we just took one sliver of that energy and united together on punching up and fixing these systems and holding them to account, then that would be something. So I do feel like we have the potential to really aim higher and to great effect. We already have the hours logged on these social media platforms. Let's put them to use rather than just jumping on the shame trains.
Yeah. Love it. All right. Well, everyone, the book is The Shame Machine: Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation by Dr. Cathy O'Neil. Cathy, thank you so much for being here today. It was a pleasure.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.